Imagine you lost your husband in a plane crash. Not a gradual loss, not an illness you had time to prepare for, a Tuesday morning departure, a routine flight, and then nothing. A plane that took off and never landed. A phone that stopped ringing. A seat at your dinner table that will never be filled again. You spend the next months in the kind of grief that reshapes your entire personality. Everything before the crash belongs to one version of your life. Everything after belongs to another. The two versions of you will never fully reconcile. And then a lawyer comes to you. Not just any lawyer. The most famous plaintiff's attorney in Los Angeles. A man who has spent 40 years fighting for ordinary people against the most powerful corporations in America. A man whose cases have literally become Hollywood films. A man whose reputation is so established, so thoroughly validated by decades of high-profile victories, that saying his name in legal circles is like saying the name of a cathedral. He tells you he is going to fight for your family. He tells you that the company responsible for your husband's death, the company that built the plane, that approved the faulty sensor, that sent 189 people to the bottom of the Java Sea, is going to pay. You trust him completely. How could you not? He wins. He secures a settlement for your family. A real number. Meaningful money that will not bring your husband back, but will ensure that his children are educated, that your mortgage is secure, that the financial dimension of your catastrophic loss is addressed. And then you wait for the money to arrive. And you wait. And you wait. And the calls to his office become increasingly difficult to complete. And the explanations become increasingly vague. And the money that was supposed to change your life after the crash, the money that a jury said you deserved, that a settlement agreement confirmed was yours, never arrives. Because your lawyer had already spent it. On a private jet. On jewelry. On the American Express bill for his wife's pop music career. On the mortgages for the mansions that appeared on a television show about wealthy women in Beverly Hills living lives of extraordinary luxury. On everything except the grieving families who had trusted him to deliver what the law had already said was theirs. His name was Thomas Vincent Girardi. For 40 years, he was called the greatest plaintiff's attorney in American history. For more than 10 of those years, he was stealing from the most vulnerable people who ever walked into his office. And on June 3, 2025, his 86th birthday, a federal judge sentenced him to 7 years and 3 months in federal prison. Welcome to Money Trial. This is the complete Tom Girardi story, and it is the most personal betrayal we have ever documented on this channel. I need you to understand something before we go through this story. Every case we cover on Money Trial involves a fraud that exploits trust. Bernie Madoff exploited the trust of investors. Elizabeth Holmes exploited the trust of patients. Sam Bankman-Fried exploited the trust of crypto depositors. Tom Girardi exploited something different. He exploited the trust of people who had already been catastrophically wrong. His clients did not come to him with money to invest. They came to him having already suffered, already lost something irreplaceable, already in the worst moments of their lives. They came to him because the legal system said they deserved justice, and he was the person positioned to deliver it. He took that positioning, the positioning of a champion, a protector, a legal warrior fighting on behalf of the powerless against the powerful, and he used it to steal from the people he was supposed to be protecting. That is not just financial fraud. That is something that exists in a moral category almost entirely its own. Let's understand every layer of how it happened. Thomas Vincent Girardi was born in 1939 in Denver, Colorado. He grew up in a working-class Catholic family and developed early the combination of ambition and personal magnetism that would define his entire professional life. He attended Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and was admitted to the California bar in 1964. What followed over the next 4 decades was a legal career that was, by any objective measure, genuinely extraordinary. Girardi built his firm, Girardi Keys, into one of the most feared plaintiffs' litigation operations in California. He specialized in cases where ordinary people had been harmed by powerful corporations, product liability, environmental contamination, medical malpractice, aviation disasters. Cases where the financial and legal resources of the defendant dwarfed those of the victim, and where winning required not just legal skill, but the ability to outwork, outmaneuver, and outlast organizations with essentially unlimited legal budgets. He was, by the accounts of colleagues, opposing counsel, and the judges before whom he appeared for decades, exceptionally good at this work. He had the ability to take extraordinarily complex scientific and technical evidence and translate it into language that ordinary jurors could understand, feel, and act on. He could make a jury care about a contaminated water table the way they cared about their own families. He could make a jury feel the weight of a corporate decision that prioritized profit over safety in a way that made the abstract viscerally personal. This skill made him wealthy, and the wealth made him influential, and the influence made him more wealthy still. By the 1990s, Girardi was one of the most connected figures in Los Angeles legal and social life. He entertained lavishly. He donated significantly to political campaigns and charitable causes. He cultivated relationships across the the entertainment industry, the legal establishment, and the political class with the same systematic attention he brought to building legal cases. He was, in the language that his own prosecutor would later use against him at trial, a celebrity. And then in 1993, he took a case that turned him from a celebrated Los Angeles attorney into a genuine national figure. In 1993, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, PG&E, was contaminating the groundwater in the small California desert town of Hinckley with hexavalent chromium, a toxic industrial chemical used in cooling operations at one of their compressor stations. The residents of Hinckley were getting sick. Cancers, tumors, illnesses that the community knew were connected to the water and that PG&E denied had anything to do with their operations. A legal clerk named Erin Brockovich, working at a small law firm, began investigating the case and brought it to her employer, who brought in Tom Girardi as co-counsel for the litigation. The case became the largest settlement ever paid in a direct action lawsuit in American history at the time, $333 million, and it changed the legal landscape for environmental contamination litigation permanently. In 2000, Universal Pictures released a film about the case. It starred Julia Roberts as Erin Brockovich. It won Julia Roberts an Academy Award for Best Actress, and it introduced the name of Tom Girardi's law firm to every American who watched it. Tom Girardi is not a character in the film, but his firm's name appears in the credits, and the story is inextricably linked to his legal practice. The Hinckley case established something about Tom Girardi's public identity that would, over the following 2 decades, become his most valuable professional asset and his most effective criminal shield. It established him as a champion of the powerless, a man who took on corporations and won, a man whose legal victories were so significant they became movies, a man whose reputation was so thoroughly built on the narrative of fighting for ordinary people against extraordinary power that the idea of him doing the opposite, using that reputation to prey upon the very ordinary people his entire professional identity was built around protecting, was almost literally inconceivable to almost everyone who knew him. That inconceivability was his greatest asset, not his legal skill, not his connections, not his wealth. The fact that his reputation made it impossible for most people to construct the sentence, "Tom Girardi is stealing from his own clients." He exploited that impossibility for over a decade. The mechanics of how a plaintiff's attorney steals from their own clients is worth understanding in detail because it is both simpler and more brazen than most people imagine. When a plaintiff's attorney like Girardi wins a settlement for a client, the settlement money is paid by the defendant, in this case, companies like Boeing or the healthcare institutions whose negligence injured the clients Girardi represented, not directly to the client, but to the law firm's client trust account. A client trust account is a segregated bank account that an attorney is legally required to maintain separately from their firm's operating accounts. The money in a client trust account belongs to the client, not the attorney. The attorney is legally prohibited from using it for any purpose other than paying the client and legitimate legal fees. The Bar Association enforces this requirement. Banks are supposed to flag suspicious patterns. Courts oversee settlement distributions. The entire system is designed with multiple redundant safeguards specifically because attorney control of client funds creates obvious theft opportunities. For Tom Girardi, these safeguards failed comprehensively, consistently, and for over a decade. Prosecutors said Girardi embezzled more than $15 million from clients involved in severe injury cases between 2010 and 2020 by stealing money from settlement funds that he claimed did not exist or were tied up in red tape. The mechanism was straightforward. A client would win a settlement. The money would arrive in Girardi's client trust account. Girardi would tell the client the settlement was still being processed, that there were legal complications, regulatory delays, administrative procedures that needed to be resolved before the money could be distributed. While the client waited, trusting the most famous plaintiff's attorney in Los Angeles to handle the details correctly, the money was quietly transferred out of the client trust account and into the operating accounts of Girardi Keys or into accounts associated with Girardi's personal expenses. From there, it funded the life that appeared on television every week: the Pasadena mansion, the private jets, the American Express bills, the jewelry, the payments to vendors associated with Erika Jayne's pop music performance career. Prosecutors argued he spent the stolen money on private jets and jewelry, keeping up a luxurious lifestyle with a sprawling Pasadena estate that was depicted on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, the reality show starring his now estranged wife, Erika Girardi, a pop singer who performs as Erika Jayne. Federal prosecutors said Girardi diverted more than $25 million from his law firm's operating account to pay expenses for EJ Global, a company formed for Jayne's entertainment career, while injured clients waited for settlement money they had already legally won. Of all the clients Tom Girardi stole from over his decade of embezzlement, one group represents the moral nadir of everything he did. In October 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, and crashed into the Java Sea 13 minutes after departure. All 189 people on board were killed. The crash was caused by a faulty sensor on Boeing's 737 MAX aircraft, triggering the plane's automated stabilization system to push the nose of the plane downward repeatedly in a pattern that the pilots could not overcome. It was one of two crashes of the 737 MAX within 5 months. The second, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, killed 157 more people. That together grounded the 737 MAX fleet worldwide and triggered one of the largest aviation safety crises in history. Tom Girardi and his firm represented 5 families who had lost loved ones in the Lion Air crash and lawsuits against Boeing. He won them a combined settlement of $12.55 million. According to the charges against Girardi, he then diverted that settlement money away from the families and into his firm's operating accounts and personal expenses. The families of people who had died in a preventable aviation disaster, people who had spent months or years in litigation, who had trusted their attorney to fight for accountability from the world's largest aerospace manufacturer, who had won that fight and received a settlement that was supposed to acknowledge what they had lost. Those families waited for money that their lawyer had already spent. Chicago attorney Jay Edelson, who had represented the families alongside Girardi, was the first person to publicly confront what had happened. He said in court filings that Girardi re-victimized those he represented in the wrongful death lawsuit. Re-victimized, that word, used by a lawyer who watched what Girardi did to the families who had come to both of them seeking justice. A family lost someone on a plane that crashed because a corporation chose to deploy a safety system without adequately training pilots to override it. They fought a legal battle. They won. They waited for their attorney to deliver what the law said was theirs. And the man who called himself their champion was using that money to pay the expenses of his wife's entertainment career. This is not a story about financial markets or investment risk or the opacity of corporate accounting. This is a story about what happened when a grieving family trusted the wrong person. The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills dimension of the Tom Girardi story is the element that gave it its enormous cultural reach, and the element that raises questions that, as of this recording, remain only partially answered. Erika Girardi, who performs professionally as Erika Jayne, joined the cast of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills in 2015. She was, by the show's standards, among the most intriguing additions the franchise had made. A pop singer who performed in elaborate costumed stage shows, married to one of the most powerful attorneys in Los Angeles, living in a sprawling Pasadena estate that the show depicted in considerable detail. Her lifestyle was extravagant even by housewife standards. Designer clothing, private jets, elaborate stage productions for her music, a team of assistants and stylists that became a recurring subject of the show's storylines. Federal prosecutors argued that a significant portion of what was shown on the show as the Girardi lifestyle was funded by stolen client money. The company managing Erika Jayne's entertainment career, EJ Global, received over $25 million transferred from Girardi's law firm's operating account. Some portion of those law firm funds were themselves client settlement money that had been stolen before reaching the operating account. Erika Jayne filed for divorce from Tom Girardi in November 2020, the same month that attorney Jay Edelson first sued Girardi for embezzling the Lion Air family's settlement money. The timing triggered immediate suspicion among prosecutors, Edelson, and the media covering the case. The lawsuit claimed the divorce was simply a sham attempt to fraudulently protect Tom's and Erika's money from those that seek to collect on debts owed by Tom and his law firm. Erika Jayne was subsequently named in a civil lawsuit alleging she knew about the embezzlement. She maintained consistently that she had no knowledge of any fraud her husband was committing. She was dismissed as a defendant from the civil lawsuit in 2022. She was never criminally charged, but the show continued airing. The divorce proceedings continued, and Erika Jayne's defense, that she was simply a wife unaware of what her husband was doing with their finances, played out in real time on a television show watched by millions of people who had their own opinions about how much a spouse can plausibly not know. The answer to that question was left to the audience. What federal prosecutors answered with evidence was the question of what Tom Girardi knew. He knew everything. By the time Jay Edelson filed his December 2020 lawsuit, the financial picture at Girardi Keys was already catastrophically deteriorated. Years of using client settlement funds to cover operating expenses and personal costs had created a cycle of debt that required constant new income to sustain. As Girardi's caseload declined, he was in his early 80s, and the firm's capacity had been diminishing for years. The gap between what the firm needed to cover its obligations and what it was actually generating became impossible to bridge. Firms to which Girardi owed money began filing lawsuits. Vendors who had not been paid began began making demands. The financial house of cards that had been maintained through a decade of client fund theft began showing visible structural stress. The divorce filing, coming simultaneously with the Edelson lawsuit, appeared to prosecutors and creditors as an attempt to use California's community property laws to shield assets from collection by placing them under Erika Jayne's individual control. California is a community property state, meaning assets acquired during a marriage are generally considered equally owned by both spouses. By filing for divorce, Girardi could potentially argue that half of the assets creditors were trying to reach belonged to his estranged spouse and were therefore complicated in their availability. This strategy, if it was a strategy, did not work as intended. The courts saw through it with relatively little difficulty, and the bankruptcy proceedings that followed the financial collapse of Girardi Keys reached back into the assets that had been moved. More importantly for the criminal case, the divorce filing itself became evidence of consciousness of guilt, a deliberate legal maneuver timed specifically to the emergence of the first major public accusation. By 2022, Tom Girardi had been disbarred in California. By 2023, he had been indicted on federal wire fraud charges. By 2024, he had been convicted on 4 counts of wire fraud after a 13-day trial, despite his attorney's arguments that his Alzheimer's disease had left him unable to form the criminal intent required for conviction. The Tom Girardi trial presented his defense team with an almost impossible task. The evidence was documentary. Settlement funds had arrived. Settlement funds had been transferred. The transfers had been made to accounts that paid for expenses that were not the client's. The paper trail was clear, extensive, and covered a decade. The defense's only realistic avenue was the one they took. Tom Girardi, they argued, had Alzheimer's disease. He was cognitively impaired. He could not have formed the deliberate criminal intent required for a fraud conviction because his disease had compromised his ability to understand what he was doing. The argument was not frivolous. Alzheimer's disease is a genuine, devastating illness, and Girardi was genuinely in cognitive decline by the time of his trial. Federal prosecutors argued that the decline had begun well after the fraud, and that the decade of embezzlement had been carried out by a man in full possession of his faculties who understood precisely what he was doing. The jury agreed with the prosecutors. They convicted Girardi on 4 counts of wire fraud for diverting at least $15 million from 4 clients, some of whom suffered serious physical injuries or lost loved ones. On June 3, 2025, Tom Girardi's 86th birthday, U.S. District Judge Josephine L. Staton sentenced him to 7 years and 3 months in federal prison. She also ordered him to pay $2.3 million in restitution to his victims and a $35,000 fine. Tom Girardi built celebrity status and lured in victims by falsely portraying himself as a champion of justice, U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada said in a statement after the sentencing. This self-proclaimed champion of justice was nothing more than a thief and a liar who conned his vulnerable clients out of millions of dollars, said U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley. Girardi's former head of accounting, Christopher Kamen, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Tom Girardi was ordered to surrender to federal authorities no later than July 17, 2025. The man who had won the Erin Brockovich case, who had appeared in the credits of an Academy Award-winning film, who had spent 40 years being called the greatest champion of ordinary people against corporate power that the California legal system had ever produced, was going to federal prison. On his birthday, the question that the Real Housewives audience has been asking since 2020, what does Erika Jayne actually know, and what will happen to her, remains only partially answered. She was dismissed from the civil lawsuit in 2022. She was never criminally charged. She maintains that she had no knowledge of the fraud her husband was committing. She continues to appear on Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. She continues to perform as Erika Jayne. She has addressed the Girardi situation on the show multiple times in ways that her co-stars and the viewing audience have found variously credible, incomplete, and frustrating. Whether Erika Jayne knew what her husband was doing and what she did or did not do with that knowledge is a question that the legal system has not answered with a criminal charge and that the public has not stopped asking. What the legal system has answered is the question of what Tom Girardi did. He stole from plane crash families. He stole from people who had lost limbs. He stole from people who had lost children. He stole from the most vulnerable people who ever trusted him. And he called himself a champion of justice for 40 years while he was doing it. Here are 5 things you can do to protect yourself from the next Tom Girardi. Protection 1. Verify your attorney's bar status before signing anything. Every licensed attorney in the United States has a verifiable bar record in their state's official bar association database. California's is at calbar.ca.gov. New York's at newyorkcourts.gov. Every state has one. Before you retain any attorney for any matter involving money, especially settlement funds, search their name and read their disciplinary history. Bar records show complaints, investigations, suspensions, and disbarments. Girardi's bar record showed complaints that were never adequately followed up on. That information was publicly available. Protection 2. Demand direct settlement payment confirmation. When you are owed settlement funds, ask your attorney directly. When was the money received by your firm? What account is it currently held in? And when specifically will it be distributed to me? You are entitled to a written accounting of your settlement funds at any point during the process. Any attorney who resists providing that accounting is an attorney whose client trust account you should be concerned about. Protection 3. Contact the defendant's attorney independently. In major litigation, the defendant's legal team can confirm when a settlement payment was transmitted to plaintiff's counsel. If you are waiting for settlement funds that your attorney says are still being processed, you have the right to contact the paying party's attorneys independently to verify when payment was actually made. If payment was made weeks or months before your attorney claimed it was still pending, that is evidence of theft. Protection 4. Report delays to your state bar immediately. If you have won a settlement and your attorney is providing vague explanations for why you have not received the money, file a complaint with your state bar association immediately before you have confirmed the theft, not after. State bars can open trust account investigations, which can freeze attorney operating accounts and trigger audits that stop ongoing theft before it consumes the entire settlement. Protection 5. Never confuse celebrity with credibility. Tom Girardi's most effective fraud tool was his reputation, his name recognition, his awards, his connections, his appearance in a Hollywood film. None of those things had any bearing on whether client settlement funds in his care were being handled honestly. Before you hire any attorney for high-stakes litigation, ask specifically, who audits your client trust account practices, and can you provide references from recent clients who have received their settlement funds? Those questions are not disrespectful. They are the due diligence that protects you. Tom Girardi is serving 7 years in federal prison. He is 86 years old. The families of Lion Air Flight 610 victims, people who lost their loved ones in a preventable aviation disaster, who spent years in litigation, who won a settlement that was supposed to acknowledge their loss, received their money only after the fraud was exposed and bankruptcy proceedings partially recovered what Girardi had stolen. They got some of what they were owed. They will never get back the years they spent waiting for a man who had already stolen what they were waiting for. The most dangerous fraud is never the one that looks dangerous. It is the one that looks exactly like the help you needed. Subscribe to MoneyTrial. We follow the money every single week so that the next person who calls themselves your champion actually is one.